So in this question, we'll discredit B and C because a luxury good and an inferior good usually refer to income with regards to demand. So as you can see here, if an individual's income were to increase, their demand or the demand curve would shift to the right because their demand for a luxury good would increase with their higher income. Also, if an individual's income were to increase, the demand for an inferior good would go down, so therefore the demand curve would go to the left. This is because they will use substitutes for like a luxury good instead. However, Joanne's talking about a price rise which wouldn't change. So as Joanne's saying, a price rise would not stop her from smoking. Therefore, it's referring to not income; it's referring to necessity. So the answer would be A, because I mean, obviously this wouldn't be the real case. But if we're taking Joanne seriously, we would say that it doesn't matter how much the price were to increase, her quantity demanded will always remain the same. For example, and this is why it's a necessity, because items such as like food and water and electricity, all those are considered necessities because it doesn't matter how high the price would be, the quantity demanded will always be the same.
So if we were to look at graph A shows a perfectly inelastic demand curve. In other words, the quantity demanded does not change no matter how much you increase the price. And that doesn't support what Yaljin is saying. He's saying that he's an addict and he'll keep on smoking, but not that much anymore, implying that a change in price would decrease his demand for smoking somewhat. So perfectly inelastic demand curve doesn't support that. So B, graph B, if we look at that, that shows a unit elastic demand curve. A unit elastic demand curve is implies that a change in price by a unit would correspond to a change in quantity demanded by that same magnitude. So a proportional price quantity relationship. And that's not indicative of Yaljin's statement, nor of an addictive substance. If we look at graph C, this shows an elastic demand curve. An elastic demand curve would be things such as pizza, bread, books, pencils, goods and services that have many substitutes. So an increase in price would mean a very big increase relatively in quantity demanded. So that doesn't support what Yaljin is saying. That doesn't support what he's saying. So if we look at D, that does. It shows not a perfectly inelastic demand curve and not an elastic demand curve, but an inelastic demand curve that has some elasticity to it. So this is indicative of an addictive substance to those people addicted are necessities. So for example, housing, electricity, water would have a curve similar to this. So just to go back to his statement, Yaljin is saying that I'm an addict, so I'll keep on smoking, but not that much anymore, implying that an increase in price would decrease his demand a bit. Okay, so first, what is deadweight loss? Deadweight loss is sort of a measurement of the inefficiency of the market due to, in this case, a tax. So we can define it in terms of the supply-demand graph in terms of how much the quantity of cigarettes that are neither produced by suppliers nor consumed by smokers. So if we were to take the top graph first, we're looking at a relatively elastic demand curve. So this middle is the market equilibrium, an elastic demand curve, and that's the price that buyers have to pay for cigarettes with this tax. That's the equilibrium price, and that's the price sellers sellers receive because of the tax. So this whole area, this whole rectangle, we could say that that's the tax revenue. So how much the government is earning in revenue because of the tax. So if we were to see the deadweight loss, the deadweight loss will be this little triangle over here. So like I said before, the quantity neither produced nor consumed because of the tax. So the QT is the quantity produced and consumed because of the tax, and QE, or the quantity at equilibrium market price, is the quantity produced and consumed at equilibrium market price. So with an elastic curve, that's how big this deadweight loss is, and we see how big the deadweight loss is by seeing the area of that triangle, or the relative increase, or the relative difference between the quantity at tax and the quantity at equilibrium. Now, if we were to look at a very inelastic demand curve, we'd straight away notice that first of all, there's a much bigger burden on buyers because of the tax. Another way to think of it is that buyers are very stubborn. No matter what tax you throw at them, they will continue to buy. So there's a big burden on them. And if we were to look at the deadweight loss, so this triangle over here, we notice it's hard to measure the area of the curve just by looking at the area of the triangle just by looking at it. But it's smaller because if we look down at quantity, the quantity produced and consumed at tax, as opposed to the quantity at equilibrium, it's a much smaller difference than with an elastic demand curve. So all other factors held constant, we can see that a more inelastic demand curve would correspond to a smaller deadweight loss. A more elastic demand curve would mean a greater deadweight loss. So, holding all other factors constant, if smokers were more sensitive to the increase in the tobacco tax, sensitive is just another way of saying if their demand curve is more elastic, the deadweight loss will be smaller. We say that is false because of what I just said. Okay, so statement number one, we're going to break statement number one into two parts. So the first part is when someone chooses to smoke. The second part is they understand that they have an increased chance of lung cancer. So, so the link between this first statement and the second one is a weak link because it's a normative statement. We would like for people that choose to smoke to understand that they have an increased chance of lung cancer, but that's not true in all cases. So it's a normative statement that weakens the conclusion. So, for example, just to illustrate this point, if we were to take two smokers from two very different population groups, one doctor, pulmonary specialist who specializes in lung cancers, and the other a teen who comes from a low socioeconomic background, a low education background, that doesn't have a good understanding of lung cancer. So obviously their understanding of the fact that they have an increased chance of lung cancer will vastly differ. So we can't just say all people that choose to smoke have this base level of understanding. And if we were to take this statement as true, which is obviously true in some cases, and we were to say, okay, some people do understand that choose to smoke, how do we know that this understanding is sufficient enough to deter them, or is sufficient? So what does this understanding involve? So this statement is implying that the purpose of scare campaigns is to provide new understandings to people, new information. And we argue that that's not the only or even primary purpose of a scare campaign. The other main purpose of a scare campaign is to serve as a jarring reminder to either those that don't know or that do know. Because as humans, we're all subject to time biases. So we focus on the immediate benefits more than the far off costs. So with smoking, we focus more on the immediate pleasure of smoking rather than the far off possibility that we'll be diagnosed with lung cancer. So that's statement number one. It's a weak statement. Statement number two is that is, the private costs to the individual are already accounted for. So the two main terms that I'm going to focus on, which will eventually lead on to statement number three, is private and already accounted for. So if we were to take already accounted for, analyze that term, already accounted for implies that just understanding the possibility that you'll get lung cancer is enough to account for that cost. And we don't necessarily disagree with that statement on the surface. So I'll demonstrate that with an analogy. So say if you were to take the 12:54 train to your destination, and then someone comes to you and says, if you wait 2 minutes and take the 12:56 train to that same destination, I'll give you $50. So you're not going to be late at all to your event. You were already early from the get-go, so 2 minutes is not going to make any difference, but you still decide to take the 12:54 train. So as soon as you get on that train, you're accounting for the cost of $50 that you just missed out on for no real reason. So in that sense, you are accounting for that cost. However, where we disagree is that smoking isn't really analogous to that analogy. So smoking isn't as instantaneous. The cost of smoking isn't as instantaneous as getting on a train. It isn't that simple, and the cost is long-term and ambiguous, and we can't really pinpoint it like that. So to say that it's already accounted for just because they choose to smoke is fallacious. So private, that's another term that we're going to analyze in statement number two, and that will eventually link onto statement number three. So private costs, the private costs to the individual are already accounted for. The scare campaigns aren't only to minimize private costs to the individual. So there are also public costs when someone is diagnosed with lung cancer. So the entire nation benefits from a decrease in the healthcare burden, especially taxpayers. So we all benefit when everyone is healthy, and the least amount of people have lung cancer. So this term, private, and then that links on to, therefore, the government should not bother wasting taxpayers' money because the private costs are already accounted for. That statement in itself is weak, and that link to the statement number three is a fallacious link, because that's implying that the whole purpose of a scare campaign is some altruistic gesture to help individuals, when it's not. The government has a self-interest in everyone else being happy, in healthy and happy. Also, if we were to take on the previous questions and say that the demand curve for cigarettes is an inelastic demand curve, we'd imply that a change in price doesn't really change the quantity of demand that much. It does, but not as much as we would like it to. So another very effective way of changing demand is to shift the demand curve. So we know that the demand curve shifts with changes in taste. So if we can make it socially unacceptable to smoke, and that historically has been the case, and Yalcin supports that in the article, saying that in Germany it's much more accepted to smoke, we'd argue that scare campaigns, help that societal shunning of smoking. So Yarjan says that because you're smoking cigarettes is looked down upon in society and the community, because you're just considered as a bad person if you smoke in Australia. So that's an effective way of shifting the demand curve to the left and decreasing demand for smoking over a long period of time. So overall, we disagree with this statement.